Silas Blackwood didn't forge steel anymore. He punished it. Every strike of his hammer against the glowing metal was an act of war against the ghosts that haunted his forge. The fire, once his partner, was now just a reminder of the one that had taken everything: his wife, his laughter, the use of his left hand. Now that hand, scarred and twisted into a permanent claw, was a testament to his failure. He had built a fortress of fire soot and bitter silence around himself, and the sign on his door might as well have read, "No hope beyond this point." Then, one sweltering afternoon, Hope walked in looking tired and out of place. She was a runaway, that much was clear. Her wedding dress was torn and stained with the dust of a long road, its white lace a mockery of a promise she'd clearly fled. She didn't ask for help, didn't plead for sanctuary. She just pointed a trembling finger at the help wanted sign he'd forgotten to take down months ago. He gave her a gruff nod and a cold corner of the forge to sleep in, expecting her to be gone by dawn. He offered her work and indifference. He never expected that her quiet, patient spirit was the one flame strong enough to melt the iron cage he'd forged around his heart. "The work is hard," Silas grunted, not bothering to look at her. "You haul coal. You work the bellows. You stay out of my way." The girl just nodded, her eyes the color of a storm-clouded sky fixed on his scarred hand. She didn't flinch or look away with pity like the others. She just saw it. "There's a cot behind the quenching trough," he said, gesturing with his good hand. "Food's on you." He turned back to the anvil, striking the hot iron with a force that sent sparks flying like angry fireflies. He was trying to scare her off, to drive her away with the heat and the noise and the sheer force of his own misery. But when he finally stopped, the ringing in his ears replaced by the forge's heavy silence, he glanced over. She hadn't run. She'd already picked up a sack of coal, her small frame straining under the weight, and was methodically carrying it to the furnace. She didn't need his welcome. She just needed the work. The first few days were a contest of wills waged in silence. The forge was a symphony of punishing sounds, the roar of the fire, the hiss of steam, the ceaseless clang of hammer on steel. Silas worked with a relentless fury, expecting the girl to buckle under the strain. But she didn't. She hauled coal until her hands were raw. She pumped the bellows with a steady, unwavering rhythm that seemed to mock his own frantic pace. She never complained, never spoke, never even met his eyes. She just worked. He noticed how she moved. She learned the forge's dangerous dance, anticipating the spray of sparks, the swing of his hammer, the searing heat from the metal. She never got in his way, but she was always there, a quiet, industrious shadow at the edge of his storm. At night, he'd watch her from the darkness of the main forge. She would eat a meager meal of bread she'd bought with the few coins he tossed her way. Then she would carefully tend to her hands, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from the hem of her ruined dress. He saw her wince as the rough fabric touched her blisters, but she made no sound. After, she would curl up on the lumpy cot facing the wall, making herself as small as possible. She didn't have a blanket. He told himself it wasn't his concern. One evening, Silas was struggling with a complex piece of ironwork, a delicate gate hinge that required a finesse his scarred hand could no longer provide. He gripped the tongs with his good hand, trying to hold the metal steady, but his damaged hand couldn't offer the support. The metal slipped. With a curse, he threw the tongs to the ground, the metal clattering loudly. He stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the useless claw at the end of his arm. It was a moment of pure, raw frustration. He expected her to shrink away from his anger. Instead, she stepped forward. She didn't speak. She simply picked up a smaller, lighter hammer from the workbench. Then she looked at the glowing hinge, and then at him. Her eyes conveyed a simple, silent question to Chomi. He was about to snarl at her to get back to her work, but something in her steady gaze stopped him. There was no fear in it, only focus. Grudgingly, he picked up the tongs again with his good hand and held the hinge over the anvil. He nodded once. She brought the small hammer down. The strike was not powerful, but it was precise. Clink. She struck again. Clink. A perfect, steady rhythm. She wasn't fighting the metal. She was coaxing it, shaping it with a patience he had long since burned away. He held, she struck. Together in the firelight, their two broken forms, his scarred hand and her silent presence, created something whole. When the hinge was finished, perfect and true, he laid it in the quenching trough. The hiss of the steam sounded less like anger and more like a sigh of relief. Silas didn't say thank you. The words were rust in his throat. But the next morning a pair of thick leather work gloves lay on the crate beside her cot. They were old and worn, but softened with oil, and they were small enough to fit her hands. It was his silent acknowledgement, his apology. She found them when she woke. She stared at them for a long time, then slowly pulled them on. They fit perfectly. For the rest of the day she worked with a new fervor, her movements just as quiet, but with a flicker, less of fear, and a flicker, more of purpose. The forge, once his solitary kingdom of pain, began to change. It was still loud, still hot, but the silence between them was no longer a weapon. It became a workspace. He learned the rhythm of her breathing as she worked the bellows. She learned the sound of his hammer striking true versus striking in frustration. He started leaving a larger share of his own meal for her without comment. She started organizing his scattered tools, putting everything back in its proper place when he was done. They were building a partnership, one silent piece of iron at a time. One afternoon, a well-dressed man on a fine horse rode up to the forge. He was loud, arrogant, his voice grating in the quiet space Silas and the girl had carved out. "Blacksmith," the man boomed, dismounting. "I'm looking for a girl. Ran off from her own wedding. Thin thing, quiet, wearing a white dress." His eyes scanned the shadows of the forge and landed on her as she froze near the coal pile. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Ah, there you are, my dear. The game is up." The girl Silas didn't even know her name went rigid. The color drained from her face, and her eyes were wide with the pure terror of a cornered animal. She looked at Silas, a desperate, silent plea in her gaze. The man took a step toward her. "Come along now. Your father is a very powerful man, and he is very, very displeased." Before the man could take another step, Silas moved. He didn't grab a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply placed himself between the man and the girl. He was larger, broader, and his presence forged in fire and grief seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He looked down at the well-dressed man, his one good eye as cold and hard as the anvil behind him. "The only girl here," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "is my apprentice, and she's not going anywhere." The man scoffed, but faltered under Silas's unblinking stare. He looked from the imposing blacksmith to the girl hiding behind him, then back again. He saw the resolve in Silas's stance, the finality in his eyes. With a muttered curse, the man turned, climbed back on his horse, and rode away, defeated not by violence, but by a quiet, immovable wall of protection. The sound of the horse's hooves faded, leaving a silence in the forge that was heavier than any before. The girl still stood behind Silas, her breathing shallow and fast. He didn't turn around right away. He just stood there, a bulwark, until he was sure the danger had passed. When he finally turned, she was staring at her own feet, her hands twisting the fabric of her worn dress. She was trembling, not with fear anymore, but with the aftershock. He had stood for her. He, a man who pushed the whole world away, had placed himself in front of her. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet. He won't be back. It was a promise. She looked up at him, then her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Her lips parted, and for the first time a sound escaped them. It was not a word, just a shaky, broken whisper of a breath, but it was more than he had ever heard from her. That night something changed. After their silent meal, she didn't immediately retreat to her cot. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the edge of the furnace and a smooth, flat piece of slate he used for sketching designs. She sat on an old crate, and in the flickering firelight she began to write. Her letters were shaky, unpracticed, but clear. She wrote one word: Leah. She held the slate up for him to see. Leah. It was her name. A piece of herself she had kept hidden and now was offering to him. Silas looked at the name, then at her. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a formal introduction made in the heart of the forge, witnessed only by the dying embers. He took a piece of charcoal himself, and on the dusty floor beside her, he wrote his own name. Silas. She looked at his name, then back at the slate in her hands. A small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was the first he'd ever seen, and it was like watching a stubborn winter flower push its way through frozen ground. From that day on, she was Leah, and the forge became less of a workplace and more of a home. She started to learn the craft, not just the labor. Silas would guide her hand, his good one, over hers, showing her how to feel the will of the metal, how to listen to its song under the hammer. He discovered a surprising patience in himself as he taught her. He was teaching her a trade, but it felt like he was teaching her a language of creation, not destruction. In return, she brought a quiet order to his chaotic world. She planted a small pot of herbs by the forge door. She mended the shirts he thought were beyond repair. One day, he came back from the mercantile to find she had cleaned the soot from the single window in his small living quarters, letting in a shaft of sunlight for the first time in years. He stood in that beam of light and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire of the forge. One evening, Silas was working late trying to finish a set of intricate iron gates for the town church. The pattern was complex, full of twisting vines and leaves, a cruel mockery of the life that used to flourish in his heart. His scarred hand ached, and his good one was clumsy with fatigue. He was struggling, his frustration mounting with every misplaced hammer blow. Leah, who had been quietly sweeping the coal dust from the corners, set her broom aside. She approached the workbench and picked up a small discarded piece of iron. Without a word, she carried it to the fire, heated it until it glowed like a captured star, and brought it to a small, unused anvil in the corner. Silas stopped his work to watch her. Using the small hammer he'd first seen her wield, she began to work the metal. Her movements were not forceful, but fluid and intuitive. She wasn't forging a gate, she was creating something else. A few minutes of patient, precise tapping, and she quenched the metal. She walked over and placed the small, warm object in his good hand. It was a single, perfectly formed iron rose. Each petal was delicate, curved with impossible grace. The stem had tiny, soft-edged thorns. It was a thing of impossible beauty, created from the same harsh materials he used to forge tools and weapons. It was art, born from the heart of the fire. He stared at the rose, turning it over and over. It was the most beautiful thing he had held in years. He looked at Leah, who was watching him with an expectant, hopeful look in her eyes. All the anger, all the bitterness he'd been hammering into the iron gates seemed to drain out of him. How he asked, his voice a choked whisper. "My father, he was a master. He could never." She pointed to the rose, then to her heart. Then she pointed to his scarred hand, and then to his heart. It was a sentence spoken without sound. "This comes from here," she was saying, "just as your pain comes from there." In that moment, Silas understood. He had been fighting the fire, punishing the steel, trying to beat his grief into submission. She had been listening to it, understanding it, and coaxing beauty from it. He closed his hand around the iron rose, its imagined scent more real than any flower. He looked at the half-finished gates, then back at Leah. For the first time, he saw not a runaway, not an apprentice, but an artist, a healer. He walked to the forge, but instead of picking up his own heavy hammer, he held out the tongs to her. "The gates," he said, his voice steady. Show me how you listen." The iron gates became their joint masterpiece. They worked side by side, a silent, seamless team. He provided the strength, the raw power needed to bend the heavy iron. She provided the artistry, guiding his hand, showing him where to strike with precision, not rage. The clang of the hammer softened, becoming less a sound of battle and more one of creation. The forge, once a place of exile, became a sanctuary of shared purpose. The townspeople noticed the change. The gates for the church were unlike anything they had ever seen. The iron seemed to flow like water, the leaves and vines so lifelike they looked as if they might rustle in the wind. They started coming to Silas, not just for the horseshoes and plowshares, but for art. A hand-forged poker with a wolf's head handle, a delicate iron weather vane shaped like a soaring hawk. And with every piece they created together, another bar on the cage around Silas's heart seemed to dissolve. One cool evening, after the fires had been banked and a soft quiet had fallen, Silas found Leah sitting by the forge door, staring out at the first stars. The iron rose he now kept on the workbench beside him. He sat down on the crate next to her. For a long time, neither spoke. "The man who came for you." Silas finally said, his voice quiet. "Your father arranged it." Leah flinched, but she didn't retreat into her silence. She nodded once. She picked up her slate and began to write. "He is a rich man. My father owed him a debt. I was the payment." The stark, simple words were more brutal than any shouted confession. "He would have hurt you," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. She looked at him, her eyes dark with memory. She nodded again, then wrote one more word. Again. A cold fury different from his old hot anger settled in Silas's chest. It was the protective anger of a man who had found something precious. He looked at her small, calloused hands, hands that could create such beauty, and thought of the cruelty they had known. He reached out not with his scarred hand, but with his good one, and gently, carefully, he covered her hands where they rested on the slate. It was the first time he had touched her with intentional tenderness. She looked down at his large, warm hand covering hers, and a single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let him see it. She let him share its weight. No one, Silas said, his voice a low, unbreakable vow, will ever lay a hand on you again. This is your home now, if you'll have it. She turned her hands over under his and laced her fingers with his. It was a silent, powerful yes. The iron cage was gone. In its place, she had helped him forge a home.